Welcome to the 63rd episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Chris Evans, author of the Iron Elves series. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Chris Evans, author of the Iron Elves series. The third book in the series, Ashes of a Black Frost, is available in bookstores now. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate you having me on your show.
Sure. Well, if someone listening isn't familiar with your Iron Elves series, can you describe the series and your latest book, Ashes of a Black Frost?
Sure. I grew up with fantasy. I didn't start reading Lord of the Rings. I mean, that's quite a lot to chew on when you're young. But I was a D&D player and read a lot of fantasy. And like a lot of people, I really enjoyed the traditional archetypes of the elf and the dwarf and magic and dragons. But I realized as I got older that a lot of people had already done that, and they'd done it very well. So if I was going to write a fantasy, which I very much wanted to do, I wanted to do it a little bit differently than had already been done. So that's what got me thinking of taking Tolkien's world and the elves and the dwarves, but bringing it forward in time, because I always thought that the medieval setting of fantasy, everyone's, it's been used so much, why not come forward? I mean, eventually that society should evolve. So I brought my series into something like a Napoleonic time frame. So there's muskets and cannons, and the social mores and the way people act, it's a little more modern than the typical medieval setting. And the other sort of main focus that I wanted is my main character is an elf, Major Conowa Swiftdragon. And I wanted an elf that hated the forest. I mean, they're always portrayed as, tree-hugging, nature-loving, flower-sniffing, to varying degrees. And I was like, there's got to be at least one elf in the history of elves who just hates everything to do with nature, and that's who my main character is.
Well, you described it really well, and I know that one description of the series has described it as muskets and magic, which I think is a really interesting combination. I can speak for myself. I've actually been a huge fan of the Sharp series by Bernard Cornwell, so I was really interested in how you combine the kind of Napoleonic feel with the fantasy archetypes. I'm curious, was there ever, do you remember a specific moment where you had that idea of having these elven and dwarves archetypes with muskets?
I remember starting, actually it was the very day that I had defended my master's thesis. And so I had just finished, this was my third degree, and I'm just like, all right, that's it for me in academia. I want to do something else. And so I went home that very day, and I started writing this novel. And at the time, I actually did begin writing it in a more traditional medieval setting, but virtually from the moment I began writing, I just had that feeling that I need to do something different. I was aware of Sharp's rifles and Richard Sharp. Bernard Cornwell is just an amazing character in that series. And of course, I'm a military historian by training, and that's what I do for a living. Is I edit military history books, everything from going back to the American Civil War, Napoleonic, up to Iraq and Afghanistan. And I just realized it made so much more sense for me to try and introduce the things that I enjoy, mixing fantasy and the military. So it pretty much began right from the start, but it was a long time and sort of percolating.
Great. Well, now that your new book, the third in the series, Ashes of a Black Frost, is published, I'm curious about the actual process of writing the three books. I'm assuming you had to plot out the overarching storyline, but was there ever a time where you thought, crap, I can't do that in the third book because of what I've already set up in the first two? Or do you just subconsciously write around those kinds of problems since the first two books have obviously been published?
You know, I'm the kind of writer who sees a distant point of light and I aim towards it, but how I get there is I leave it a little bit up to chance and mystery. So I have a concept of, okay, what the arc's going to be for both the book and for individual characters, but I also find that I like to leave myself openings in case something occurs that maybe I didn't realize. Now, there were a couple of cases by the time I got to this final book, Ashes of a Black Frost, where something occurred to me that I thought, oh, wouldn't that be a neat twist? But then I looked back and I said, oh, you know what? I can't really do that because of something I had done in the first book or the second book. But even when that happens, you know, I ended up thinking of something else that worked just as well. And the thing I always tell aspiring authors, because everybody, I think, you know, most of us are, even if you're a published author, you're always aspiring because you're always working on the next one. But it's like the ideas are the easy part. The hard part is sitting on your butt day after week after month after year and cranking it out. You know, the ideas flow fast and furious, but it's that patience and just being able to sit down and push the vision through after the novelty's worn off, after the excitement has gone, and it's just you and a pad of paper or a laptop or an iPad, whatever you write on, and suddenly it's like, wow. But it's like a marathon, one step at a time. It's, you know, one word, one sentence, and eventually you have a book.
Right. Well, you mentioned earlier your day job as an editor of nonfiction military history books. How do you think your work as an editor has impacted your own fiction writing? Do you think you're more critical of your own writing than some writers might be?
Yes, I think it's been both a plus and a minus. The plus is that being an editor and working in the publishing business for over 10 years, I actually started with Random House, so I've been in the thick of it from the beginning of my career. I know a lot of how the business works,
Right.
so that's been an advantage. But the great disadvantage of being an editor is I have a tendency to try to edit as I write, which is a terrible thing to do, I think. I think what you need to do, and what I've found for myself, is just let the creative process happen, knowing that you're going to go back and reread and revise, and that an editor is going to do the same thing, and that proofreaders will look at it, and copy editors, because by constantly revising as I write, I think it takes me much longer than it otherwise would. So that's actually been more of an impediment than an advantage.
Right. Well, as you just mentioned that you understand the business side of publishing, and given that and the fact that you're a published author and your new book is published in hardback and as an ebook, where do you see the publishing industry as a business headed? Obviously, there's the rapid growth of ebooks, Amazon serving as a publisher directly. Where do you think we're headed?
You know, that's that's a great question. I'm not going to pretend to say that I know the answer. What I will say is that anybody who tries to predict the demise of the publishing industry based on the current economic climate is really not giving the publishing industry a fair shake. I mean, we are in the closest thing to the Great Depression right now. So when you consider that when people are worried about where the next meal's coming from, are they going to be able to put their kids through school, they're probably less likely to be spending on a luxury item, which would be a book. Because, you know, as much as we want to believe that people need books, the reality is people have to want books. They're entertainment. And so when you look at the trouble with bookstores and with overall the publishing industry, I think the fact that hardcovers and some of the more expensive type formats are having trouble is we're just in a terrible economy. Now, that doesn't mean that if everything were wonderful today that the publishing industry still wouldn't have problems. It would. And there's no question ebooks are only getting stronger. However, George R. R. Martin's latest book came out, and they sold more hardcovers than they did ebooks. And I think fantasy is at least one genre in particular where people still prefer to have that hardcover book in their hand as opposed to an electronic file.
Sure. You mentioned earlier that you grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons and reading fantasy. Who are some of the writers that you enjoy reading when you're not working on your own material?
I'm a huge, just insanely huge Terry Pratchett fan. His brand of humor and social satire, it hits me every possible way. I just can't say enough about it. And I recognize at the same time, not everybody likes what he does or gets what he does, but I think that's what happens when you write humor and satire. But for me, Terry Pratchett is, he's right up there in my pantheon of all-time writers. I was and remain a huge fan of J.K. Rowling. I mean, I think Harry Potter was fantastic. I'm also, he's passed away now, but George MacDonald Fraser, he wrote something called the Flashman series, which is a character, who, again, kind of musket and swashbuckling adventures all through the British Empire. He also served in the Second World War and wrote a phenomenal memoir called Quartered Safe Out Here, which is taken from a poem from one of my other favorite authors, Rudyard Kipling. So it's, and I also enjoy reading nonfiction, considering my job. There's a lot of historians like Barbara Tuchman, Stephen Ambrose, who, of course, is famous for Band of Brothers. People who are great storytellers. There's really, I could just keep naming names here for the next hour.
I won't make you do that. So you mentioned earlier some advice for aspiring writers. What other advice might you have for someone who is working on their own novels or short stories and hoping to have them published professionally?
I mean, you follow your own star. And, in my book, that's actually a motif that there's falling stars, but that's really not what I didn't mean to tie them in. I just realized it happened. But the thing is, if you worry about the trends, because apparently, the trends right now, zombies are hot, vampires are hot. But if you try to follow a trend, by the time you get there, there's probably a new trend. And even if you get there and that trend's still hot, keep in mind, when somebody has already written a phenomenal book on a young boy going to a British boarding school for magic, aka Harry Potter, why would you want to be just a copy of that? So find your voice, find your story. The other really important thing I tell everyone, and I follow this religiously myself, is you have to read. It's not enough to think about it and to watch movies, watch TV, play all the video games, as much fun as they are. If you don't read, and read a lot, and read widely, and by that I mean, if you want to write fantasy, don't just read other fantasy books. In writing my fantasy, a lot of my research, a lot of my reading was military history. Other writers are reading a lot of other things, so you need to open yourself up and read books. For me, as a writer, I know romance is not exactly one of my strong suits. So I'm actually starting to read some of the romance books. I want to see how they do it. It doesn't mean that that's what I'm always going to read, but, to be a writer, you have to be open. And that means including to reading things that you might not otherwise read. And the one other big thing, because I see it a lot, especially in fantasy, when you've written your first fantasy novel, and if it doesn't immediately sell, or an agent doesn't say they're going to represent you, a lot of people, and it's understandable, they want to revise it, and then revise it again, and they keep wanting to revise the same book over and over. And the thing that I tell everyone is the moment you finish writing your first book, you celebrate, and the next day you begin writing a brand new book. And don't start writing book 2 of your trilogy or your series, because if you can't sell the first book, they're certainly not going to buy book 2 of a trilogy when you couldn't sell book 1. So, try something a little different. If your first fantasy was medieval, then maybe try a fantasy that's a different setting. Because eventually you sell a book, stuff you wrote earlier, you can always come back to, maybe revise it and then sell it.
Sure.
So try not to get stuck rewriting the same book over and over.
Right. Good advice. So what's next for you after Ashes of a Black Frost?
Well, I'm already hard at work on my next book. It's going to be another fantasy within, I guess, the subgenre that's called military fantasy as well as epic fantasy. But it's going to be, I'm writing it as just a single big standalone book. And it's going to be darker, and essentially it's going to really delve into and tear apart the race relations between the traditional fantasy archetypes. So elf, dwarf, and human, because, there's this real trend now in fantasy where, like Martin, people are basically, it's like soft, light magic. There's very little magic, and basically it's only humans. And that seems that, there's this one view that that's the only way you can really write dark, serious stuff now, that somehow elves can't have the same problems and the same issues. It can only be done with humans. And I think, no, absolutely. I mean, we've been stuck, or not stuck, but we've had these archetypes for so long that it's more than time to really kind of get in there, rip them apart, and just see what that would look like in, an incredible pressure cooker of a scenario, which I'm going to create that, will only compound these issues and hopefully, make an entertaining story out of it too.
That sounds like fun. We'll look for that. Where can readers find you online?
I have a website. It's Chris Evans Author, allrunstogether.com. I'm also on Twitter as C Evans Author, pretty easy. And I blog fairly regularly. I'm on Facebook too. I get all the major social media. You can probably find me, and I'm always happy to talk to people. I get emails all the time, and I respond to everyone. I even for fans who live far away and don't get a chance to come to a convention or something, I'm always happy to send out signed book plates for their books, no charge. They just have to email me, and I'm happy to sign and send them.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Chris Evans, author of the Iron Elves series. Ashes of a Black Frost, the latest book in the series, is available in bookstores now or as an ebook. Chris, thanks for doing the interview.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
Hi, this is author Peter Arulian, author of The Unremembered, and you're listening to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
Thanks for listening to my latest podcast. If you have a chance, please leave a review of the podcast in iTunes. It only takes a moment. Until next time, read some good books and be well.
Audible has the best in audio entertainment, like Yearbook, Seth Rogen's new collection of laugh-out-loud personal essays told by Seth with help from friends like Nick Kroll, Dan Aykroyd, and Jason Segel. With Audible, hear the latest bestsellers and new releases, plus loads of included podcasts, originals, and audiobooks that you can listen to all you want. Start a free 30-day trial today at audible.com.
At Kings Island, it's never too early to start thinking about next year's fun. That's why we're offering the lowest price of the year on a 2022 Gold Pass right now. That includes unlimited visits this year, so you can enjoy Tricks and Treats Fall Fest, Haunt, and Winterfest. Then unlimited visits next year to try new foods, hang with the Peanuts gang at Planet Snoopy, scream on our world-class coasters, and splash away at Soak City Water Park. All for as low as $105 plus applicable taxes and fees. Hurry, offer ends soon, so get your Gold Pass now at visitkingsisland.com. It's amazing in here.